Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Aurora and stared at the screen. What he saw made no sense. 12 massive ships floated in the empty space between stars. They looked old and broken, like someone had built them from scrap metal and forgotten. About them. "Captain, are you seeing this?" Amy Phillips walked over to him. She was the ship's expert on old alien things. Her eyes were wide as she looked at the display. These ships looked like they were built by children playing with metal. Blocks. The ships were huge but ugly. They had thick metal walls and strange bumps sticking out everywhere. Most ships Jake had seen were smooth and clean, with curved lines that looked nice. These ships looked like boxes with guns stuck on them. Ben Carter, the ship's engineer, ran his hands over his control panel. Numbers and data filled his screen. He shook his head and made a face like he had tasted something bad. "Sir, I can't believe what I'm reading. These ships run on old fusion power. That's like using a campfire to heat a mansion." Jake had been exploring space for 10 years. He had seen ships from dozens of different alien races. Some were beautiful, some were strange, but all of them were advanced. These ships looked like they came from a museum. "What about weapons?" Jake asked. Ben laughed, but not in a happy way. "They have metal bullets, sir. Actual metal bullets that they shoot out of tubes. No energy beams, no plasma cannons, just chunks of metal flying through space." Amy walked closer to the main screen. The lead ship was bigger than the others. It had more guns and thicker armor, but it still looked primitive. "I've studied hundreds." "Of dead civilizations?" "Even the most backward ones had better technology than this." Jake made a decision. "We're going aboard." "Amy, Ben, suit up. We need to see what these things are." The boarding pod attached to the biggest ship with a soft bump. Jake felt his heart beating fast as the airlock opened. The corridor beyond was narrow and dark. Their helmet lights showed metal walls covered in rust and scratches. "The air is breathable," Amy said, checking her scanner. "But it smells like oil and metal." They moved through the ship slowly. Everything was manual. Doors had to be opened by hand. Control panels had switches and buttons instead of touch screens. The walls were covered in pipes and wires that looked like they might fall apart at any moment. "This is impossible," Ben whispered. "How did they even make it into space? With this junk?" They found what looked like a command center. Chairs were bolted to the floor in front of screens that showed only green text. The screens were small and thick, like the old computers Jake had seen in history books that Amy found a room full of beds. They were small and hard, with thin blankets. "Whoever lived here wasn't very comfortable," she said. "And look at this." She pointed to scratches on the wall next to each bed. They were counting days. Jake studied the scratches. There were thousands of them, grouped in sets of 5. Someone had been on this ship for a very long time. They explored more rooms. One was full of weapons that looked like the gun soldiers, used hundreds of years ago. Another had suits of armor made from metal plates. Everything was simple and rough, but it was also strong and well made. "Sir, you need to see this," Ben called from another room. He was standing next to a large machine that hummed quietly. "This is their power source. It's a fusion reactor, but it's built like a tank. It's primitive, but it would be almost impossible to break." Amy was examining the walls with her scanner. "The metal is thick, really thick. This isn't just armor. It's like they expected to get hit by something huge." Jake felt confused. The ships were clearly built for war, but they were so old-fashioned that any modern weapon would destroy them easily. Why would someone build a war fleet that couldn't win a fight? They found the ship's computer core. It was a room full of metal, boxes covered in blinking lights. The boxes were connected by thick cables, and the whole thing made noise like an old factory. "I can access their files," Amy said, plugging her scanner into one of the boxes. "But the language is completely unknown. The symbols don't match anything in our database." Jake watched as strange symbols filled Amy's screen. They looked like letters and numbers, but they were arranged in patterns he had never seen before. Some looked almost familiar, like he had seen them in old Earth history books. "How long will it take to translate?" Jake asked. "Months, maybe longer," Amy replied. "This is completely different from any language we know." As they prepared to leave, Jake noticed something carved into the wall near the main control station. The symbols were deeper and clearer than the others, like someone had taken extra time to make them perfect. "Amy, look at this," he said. She scanned the symbols and frowned. "These are different. They're not in the same style as the computer. Text, they might be a name or a title." Jake stared at the symbols. Something about them felt important, but he couldn't understand what they meant. The ship around them felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. They returned to the Aurora with boxes of data storage devices and samples of the strange metal. Jake stood on his bridge again, looking at the 12 ships floating in space. They looked even stranger now that he had been inside one. "What do you think, Captain?" Amy asked. Jake was quiet for a long moment. "I think we found something important. These ships weren't built by people who didn't know better. They were built by people who knew exactly what they were doing. But why would anyone choose to build ships like this?" Jake didn't have an answer. But as the Aurora moved away from the ancient fleet, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had discovered something that would change everything. The ships looked like junk, but they felt like secrets. The news about the primitive ships spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Every space station, every planet, every ship captain was talking about the ancient fleet that looked like it was built from garbage. The story got bigger and funnier. Each time someone told it, Lisa Harper stood in front of the Galactic Council. She was the best expert on dead alien races in known space. Behind her, a huge screen showed pictures of the human ships next to modern warships. The difference was embarrassing. "Honored members of the Council," Lisa began, "we have found the most backward spacefaring race in galactic history. These ships represent technology that most civilizations abandoned thousands of years ago." The council chamber was filled with representatives from 47 different worlds. Some looked like humans, others were completely alien. All of them were staring at the screen and trying not to laugh. Velter, the Zephyrian ambassador, was tall and made of living crystal. When he spoke, his voice sounded like wind chimes. "Their weapons could not scratch the paint on our ships. Our shields would stop their bullets before they traveled a meter. The Zephyrian ships were works of art. They looked like flying jewels, with smooth curves and weapons that fired pure energy. Next to them, the human ships looked like flying rocks. Kreith from the Andromedan Empire was even less impressed. The Andromedans had ships that could think for themselves and repair damage instantly. One of our plasma torpedoes would melt. Their entire fleet," he said with a sound that might have been laughter. The council chamber erupted in noise as different species made their versions of laughter. Some chirped, some hummed, and some made sounds that had no human equivalent. But they were all laughing at the same thing. "Look at their armor," said Ambassador Quinn from the Stellar Federation. "It's just thick metal. They don't even have energy shields. How did they survive their first battle?" Lisa clicked to the next image. It showed the inside of one of the human ships. The narrow corridors and manual controls looked like something from a primitive submarine. Their crew quarters are tiny. Their food storage is basic. They don't even have artificial gravity in most sections. The mockery continued for hours. Military commanders from across the galaxy used the human ships as examples of what not to build. Admiral Voss from the Galactic Defense Force said the ships were so bad they would make good training targets. "My cadets need to practice shooting at something that moves slowly," he joked. These ships would be perfect. The jokes spread beyond. The council chamber. Comedy shows on dozens of worlds featured skits about the primitive humans. Children played games where they pretended to be the backward aliens, flying their metal boxes through space. On the trading station Deep Space Nine, merchants sold toy versions of the human ships. They were popular because they were funny to look at. The toys came with labels that said ancient junk and primitive technology. Jake Morrison watched the news coverage from his quarters on the Aurora. Each report made the human ships sound more ridiculous. Experts explained how the ships would be useless in any real battle. Scientists wondered how such a backward race had even survived long enough to build a fleet. But Jake couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen on the ships. The thick armor wasn't just protection. It was designed to stop something specific. The simple technology wasn't because the builders didn't know better. It was because they had chosen to build that way. "Captain, you're not watching the comedy show about the humans, are you?" Amy Phillips sat down next to him. Even she was smiling about the whole thing. "Amy, something bothers me about all this," Jake said. "Those ships were built for war." "Real war? But why would someone build a war fleet that any modern ship could destroy?" Amy shrugged. "Maybe they were just really stupid. Or maybe they were fighting each other instead of real enemies." Jake shook his head. The damage patterns on those ships weren't from fighting other primitive ships. They were from fighting something else. Something that could hurt them even. Through all that armor, the jokes continued for weeks. The human ships became a symbol of technological failure. Engineering students studied them to learn about bad design. Military historians used them as examples of why civilizations failed. Admiral Rex Thompson of the Terran Defense Force watched the coverage from his office on Earth. His face showed no emotion as species after species made fun of human technology. His aide, Captain Paul Green, was clearly angry. "Sir, are we going to let them keep insulting us like this?" Paul asked. Thompson was quiet for a long moment. He was old enough to remember things that younger officers had forgotten. "Let them." "Laugh, Captain. Sometimes it's better to be underestimated." "But, sir, they're calling us primitive. They're saying we're too stupid to build real ships." Thompson turned to look out the window at the stars. "Paul, there are things in this galaxy that those advanced civilizations have never seen. Things that would make their beautiful ships useless. Sometimes the old ways are the only ways that work." The mockery reached its peak when the Galactic Military Academy announced they would use the human ships as training exercises. Students would practice destroying primitive vessels to learn basic combat skills. "It will be like shooting practice," said Instructor Webb during a broadcast. "These ships are so slow and weak that even our newest pilots can destroy them easily." The announcement was broadcast across the galaxy. It was seen as the ultimate insult. The human ships were so pathetic they were only good for target practice. But in the depths of space, far from the laughing crowds and mocking experts, something was stirring. Old signals were starting to broadcast. Again, ancient warnings were being repeated in languages that had been forgotten for centuries. The human ships floating in the void between stars were not just relics of a dead civilization. They were sentries standing guard against something that the galaxy had forgotten existed. And soon, very soon, that something would remind everyone why the humans had built their ships the way they did. The laughter would stop. The jokes would end. And the galaxy would learn that sometimes the most advanced civilizations were those that remembered the old threats and prepared for their return. But for now, the humans were just a joke. A primitive race that had built ships from scrap metal and thought they could fight in space. The galaxy would keep laughing until the day they needed those crude metal boxes to save them all. Karen Wells had been staring at the same symbols for 6 hours straight. Her eyes hurt and her head was pounding, but she couldn't stop working. The language from the human ships was like nothing she had ever seen before. She was the best translator in the galaxy. She had decoded the languages of 37 dead civilizations, but these symbols were different. They seemed familiar somehow, like she had seen them in a half-remembered dream. "Dr. Wells, you need to get some sleep," her assistant, Mark Johnson, said as he brought her another cup of coffee. "You've been working for 3 days straight." Karen rubbed her eyes and looked at the screen again. The symbols were arranged in patterns that almost made sense. Some looked like letters, others like numbers. But they were connected in ways that didn't match any language she knew. "Mark, look at this," she said, pointing to a group of symbols. "These appear at the beginning of every file. They might be headers or titles." Mark studied the screen. He was young but smart, and he had good eyes for patterns. They do repeat a lot, but what do they mean? Karen had been asking herself the same question for weeks. The symbols were everywhere on the human ships. They were on walls, on computer screens, on equipment, even carved into the metal itself. Whoever had built these ships had used this language. For everything, the breakthrough came at 2 in the morning. Karen was looking at a sequence of symbols when she noticed something. The pattern was mathematical. It wasn't random. It was a code. "Mark, wake up," she said, shaking her sleeping. "Assistant, I think I found something." Mark stumbled over to her workstation, still half asleep. "What is it?" "These aren't just symbols. They're instructions." "Look," Karen pointed to the screen. "This sequence shows up every time before technical information. It's like a computer command." They worked together for the next 4 hours. Slowly, the patterns began to make sense. The symbols weren't just a language. They were a complete system for running the ships. Every command, every piece of information, every warning was written in this code. The first real translation came from a simple file. It was a list of supplies, written in basic terms that were easy to understand. Suddenly, Karen could see what the symbols meant. Food supplies low. Water recycling at 60%. Ammunition reserves critical. Karen read the translation out loud. "Mark, this isn't just a language. It's a military report." More translations followed quickly. The files were full of information about battles, supplies, and something called the mission. The humans had been fighting something, and they had been fighting for a long time. Karen called Jake Morrison as soon as she had enough translations to make sense of the story. "Commander, you need to come to the lab right away. What we found changes everything." Jake arrived 20 minutes later, still wearing his sleep clothes. Amy Phillips and Ben Carter came with him. They all looked tired but excited. "What did you find?" Jake asked. Karen pulled up the translated files on her main screen. "These ships aren't just primitive vessels. They're part of something called the Great Fleet. They were built by the United Earth Systems in response to an emergency." "What kind of emergency?" Amy asked. Karen clicked to the next file. "Something called the Dark Signal. According to these logs, Earth received an alien transmission from outside the galaxy. The signal caused mass insanity and violence on human colonies. People exposed to it became murderous and destructive." The room was quiet as Karen read more translations. The story that emerged was terrifying. The signal had appeared suddenly, broadcast from somewhere beyond the edge of known space. Within days, entire human colonies had turned violent. Ships had attacked each other. Orbital stations had fired on the planets below. "Listen to this," Karen said, reading from a translated log. "Mission log, day 234. Admiral Patricia Hayes reporting. The signal is getting stronger. We lost 3 more colonies yesterday. The government has authorized the Great Fleet Project. We're going to find the source and destroy it. Jake felt cold as he listened. How many ships did they build? Karen scrolled through more files. Thousands. They stripped every asteroid belt, every mining station, every industrial complex. They built the largest fleet in human history. Ben Carter looked at the translated technical specifications. These ships weren't primitive because they didn't know better. They were designed this way on purpose. Look at these notes about shielding systems. The files explained everything. The humans had discovered that advanced technology was vulnerable to the signal. Energy shields failed. Computer systems became corrupted. AI units turned against their creators. The more advanced the technology, the more dangerous it became. So they went backward, Amy said, understanding dawning in her voice. They built ships that couldn't be affected by the signal. Karen nodded. Thick metal armor instead of energy shields. Simple computers instead of AI. Manual controls instead of automated systems. Everything was designed to be immune to whatever was broadcasting the signal. More translations revealed the scope of the human response. They had built ships in secret, hiding them from the signal's influence. They had developed new weapons specifically designed to fight an enemy that could turn their own technology against them. They had prepared for a war unlike any other. What happened to them? Jake asked. Karen pulled up the final log entries. They left. The entire Great Fleet departed Earth 200 years ago. Their mission was to find the source of the signal and destroy it. The last translated message was from Admiral Hayes herself. We are departing for the Galactic Rim. We don't know what we'll find out there, but we know we have to stop it. If we don't return, remember that we chose to build these ships this way. The galaxy will call us primitive, but sometimes primitive is what wins wars. Jake stared at the screen in shock. The ships that the galaxy had been laughing at weren't the products of a backward civilization. They were the products of a civilization that had faced an unimaginable threat and adapted to fight it. There's more, Karen said. I found references to previous incidents. The humans have records of similar signals appearing throughout their history. They've been preparing for this for centuries. Amy looked at the translated files with new understanding. That's why everything on the ships was built to last. They weren't just going on a short mission. They were going to war against something that could destroy advanced civilizations. Ben studied the technical specifications with growing amazement. These ships are incredibly well designed for their purpose. Every system has backups. Every component is built to survive massive damage. They're not primitive. They're perfect for fighting something that can corrupt technology. Jake felt a chill as he realized what they had discovered. The fleet we found, those aren't all the ships. Those are just the ones that stayed behind to guard the route home. Karen nodded grimly. According to the logs, the main fleet is still out there. They've been fighting beyond the galactic rim for 200 years. The room was silent as they absorbed the implications. The galaxy had been laughing at ships that were actually protecting them, while advanced civilizations had been building prettier and more complex vessels. The humans had been maintaining a fleet designed to fight the galaxy's greatest threat. We need to tell the Council, Amy said. Jake shook his head. They won't believe us. They'll say we're making excuses for primitive technology. But as they spoke, deep space monitors across the galaxy began detecting something new. A faint signal, barely noticeable at first, was beginning to broadcast from beyond the rim of known space. It was weak now, but it was growing stronger. The dark signal was returning, and the galaxy was about to learn why the humans had built their ships the way they did. The signal started on a Tuesday morning. Lieutenant Danny Brooks was working the night shift at Deep Space, Monitor Station 7, when his equipment picked up something strange. At first, it was just a whisper on the edge of sensor range. By lunch time, it had become a roar that could be heard across half the galaxy. "Captain Miller, you need to see this," Danny called to his supervisor. His hands were shaking as he adjusted the controls. "Something is broadcasting from outside the galaxy." "Captain." Steve Miller walked over to Danny's station. He was a veteran who had seen everything in 30 years of space service. But what he saw on the screen made his blood run cold. The signal was unlike anything in the database. It pulsed with a rhythm that seemed almost alive, and it was growing stronger every hour. Worse, it seemed to be affecting the station's equipment. Computer screens flickered. Lights dimmed and brightened randomly. The air recycling system made strange noises. "Send a priority alert to Fleet Command," Miller ordered, "and try to boost our shielding. I don't like what this thing is doing to our systems." But boosting the shielding made things worse. The more advanced the technology, the more the signal affected it. Within hours, reports were coming in from across the galaxy. Space stations were reporting equipment failures. Ships were losing navigation systems. Planets were calling for help as their defense grids malfunctioned. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was chaos. Representatives from dozens of worlds were all talking at once, reporting the same terrifying news. Their most advanced technology was turning against them. Admiral Rex Thompson sat quietly in the observer section, watching the panic unfold. His aide, Captain Paul Green, leaned over to whisper, "Sir, should we tell them about the human fleet?" Thompson shook his head slightly. "Not yet. Let them figure it out themselves." Ambassador Valtar from the Zephyrian Empire was the first to report total system failure. "Our crystal ships are shattering. The signal is resonating with our hull. Materials. We've lost contact with 3 fleets. The Andromedan Empire was even worse off. Their AI-controlled ships had become completely uncontrollable. Our fleets are firing on our own colonies," Ambassador Creed H. reported, his voice filled with panic. "We had to manually destroy our own command ships to stop them." Lisa Harper, the Xena historian who had mocked the human ships just months earlier, stood at the emergency podium. Her face was pale as she read the reports. "The signal is specifically targeting advanced technology. Energy shields are failing. AI systems are becoming hostile. Plasma weapons are overloading." Every species that had laughed at the primitive human ships was now helpless. The Stellar Federation's beautiful energy-based vessels were dead in space. The Galactic Defense Force's most advanced warships were turning on each other. The more sophisticated the technology, the more dangerous it became. On the trading station Deep Space Nine, panic was spreading. Merchants were abandoning their advanced ships and trying to find passage on older, simpler vessels. The toy human ships that had been sold as jokes were now being studied by desperate engineers looking for design ideas. Captain Frank Davis was commanding the merchant vessel Simple Life. When the signal hit, his ship was old and basic, with manual controls and thick metal walls. While the advanced ships around him were failing, his primitive vessel kept working. "This is incredible," he radioed to other ships. "The signal isn't affecting us at all. Our simple systems are completely immune." But most ships weren't simple. They were marvels of advanced engineering, with AI assistants, energy shields, and weapons that could destroy planets. All of that technology was now a liability. The crisis deepened when the signal began affecting planetary systems. On the crystal world of Zephoria, the living cities began to scream as the signal resonated through their structure. On Andromeda, Prime, the AI that controlled the planet's weather, started creating massive storms. Then, through the chaos and panic, came a new transmission. It was broadcasting on an old frequency that most ships couldn't even receive. The message was in primitive binary code, the same code that had been found on the human ships. Jake Morrison was one of the few people who could decode it. He was. On the Aurora, which had been modified with simple backup systems after studying the human fleet. As he translated the message, his hands began to shake. "This is Admiral Patricia Hayes of the United Earth System's Great Fleet. We are returning from our mission beyond the galactic rim. We have neutralized the primary source, but we encountered multiple secondary installations. We are damaged and low on supplies, but we are bringing the war home." The message continued in the same calm, professional tone. "All vessels be advised that we are implementing immediate quarantine protocols. Any ship or station showing signs of signal corruption will be destroyed. We are coming in loud and messy, but we are coming home." Jake immediately contacted the Galactic Council. "You need to hear this," he told them. "The human fleet is returning, and they're bringing the fight with them." The council chamber erupted in confusion. How could a primitive fleet that had been gone for 200 years suddenly return? And what did they mean by bringing the war home? The answer came 12 hours later. Long-range sensors detected a massive fleet approaching from the galactic rim. It was huge, hundreds of ships, all built in the same primitive style as the derelict fleet they had discovered. But these ships were alive with activity, their simple systems working perfectly, while advanced technology failed all around them. "Admiral Hayes," voice crackled across the emergency frequency again. "This is for all the species who thought we were primitive. We built these ships to fight a war you couldn't imagine. We've been holding the line beyond the rim for 200 years. Now stand back and let us clean up the mess." The human fleet moved through space like a force of nature. Their thick metal hulls were scarred and dented from centuries of battle. Their simple weapons looked crude compared to modern technology, but they worked. While every advanced ship in the galaxy was either dead or turning against its creators, the human fleet was fully operational. Admiral Thompson finally stood up in the council chamber. "You wanted to know why we built our ships that way," he said quietly. "Now you know. We've been preparing for this day for centuries." The human fleet began systematically destroying every ship and station that had been corrupted by the signal. Their primitive kinetic weapons, the same bullets that had been mocked as useless, punched through the hulls of advanced vessels that had been designed to resist energy weapons. "Their bullets are going right through our shields," reported Captain Wells from the Zephyrian flagship. "Our energy defenses are useless against solid projectiles." That was the point. The humans had learned long ago that the enemy they faced had adapted to fight advanced civilizations. Energy weapons could be corrupted. Shields could be overloaded. AI systems could be turned against their creators. But a simple piece of metal fired from a magnetic railgun was just physics. It couldn't be corrupted or controlled as the human fleet moved through the galaxy. They left a trail of destroyed, corrupted vessels and restored order. Their primitive technology was exactly what was needed to fight an enemy that turned advanced civilizations against themselves. The galaxy watched in amazement as the ships they had mocked as backward junk proved to be the most effective weapons in known space. The humans hadn't been primitive. They had been prepared. Admiral Hayes broadcast one final message as her fleet secured the core worlds. "We're going to need every shipyard in the galaxy converted to build simple, robust vessels. This isn't over. We killed the main source, but there are others out there. The watch continues." The joke was over. The galaxy now understood that the most advanced civilizations were sometimes those that knew when to go backward. 3 months after the dark signal crisis, the galaxy was a different place. The beautiful advanced ships that had once filled space were gone, replaced by crude metal vessels that looked like the human fleet. Every shipyard in known space was working around the clock to build simple, robust ships that could survive the next attack. Jake Morrison, stood on the bridge of the U.S. Defiant, the same ship he had explored when it was a derelict floating in space. Now it was alive with activity, its crew working efficiently at their manual controls. Admiral Patricia Hayes had invited him aboard to see how the ship really worked. "You thought we were primitive," Hayes said with a tired smile. She was older than Jake had expected, with gray hair and scars on her face that spoke of long years in battle. "I suppose from your perspective, we were." Hayes led Jake through the ship, showing him systems that had seemed crude, but were actually masterfully designed. The thick metal walls weren't just armor. They were carefully engineered to absorb and redirect energy. The simple computers weren't backwards. They were specifically designed to be immune to signal corruption. "How did you know?" Jake asked. "How did you know to build ships this way?" Hayes stopped at a wall covered in strange symbols. Jake recognized them now as the ancient human writing they had found throughout the ship. "Because this isn't the first time it's happened. We've been fighting this enemy for thousands of years." She pressed a panel, and the wall slid open to reveal a hidden room. Inside were stone tablets covered in primitive drawings. Jake stared at them in amazement. They showed stick figures fighting strange creatures under alien stars. They showed great ships built from metal and fire. They showed humanity's ancient war against the signal. "Our ancestors called it the voice from the dark," Hayes explained. "Every few thousand years, it finds a way to reach into our galaxy. It targets the most advanced civilizations first, turning their technology against them. We've seen it happen before." Dr. Karan Wells, who had joined the tour, studied the ancient tablets. "These drawings, they're not just art, they're instructions. They're telling future generations how to fight." Hayes nodded. "Each time the signal returns, we have to start over. We have to abandon our advanced technology and return to basics." The cave paintings weren't just pictures. They were warnings passed down through generations. Jake looked at the tablets more closely. One showed humans building ships in secret, hiding them from something that watched from the sky. Another showed great fleets departing Earth, heading toward the darkness between stars. The story was always the same. Humanity would detect the signal, build a fleet to fight it, and disappear for centuries while they held the line. "We're not the first human fleet," Hayes continued. "We're just the latest. There have been dozens of expeditions over the millennia. Each time, we leave behind enough people to rebuild civilization and prepare for the next attack." The revelation sent chills through Jake. Humanity wasn't just a species that had fought the signal once. They were the galaxy's eternal guardians, condemned to forever sacrifice their technological progress to protect everyone else. "The other species don't know," Hayes said quietly. "They advance and prosper while we stand watch. They build beautiful ships and explore the galaxy while we patrol the darkness beyond the rim. They think we're primitive, but we're the reason they can afford to be advanced." Captain Amy Phillips, who had also joined the tour, asked the question that was bothering everyone. "How many of you are there? How many ships?" Hayes smiled grimly. "Not enough. We lost over half our fleet in the last campaign. The signal was stronger this time, and it had built more installations. We barely stopped it." She led them to another section of the ship where the walls were covered in names. Thousands of names, carved into the metal by hand. Each name represented a ship that had been lost, a crew that had died in the darkness beyond the galaxy. "These are the real heroes," Hayes said. "The ones who died so that advanced civilizations could keep building their pretty ships. The ones who sacrificed everything so that the galaxy could remain ignorant of the threat." Jake studied the names. Many were followed by dates that went back centuries. Some sections of the wall were older than others, showing that this tradition of remembering the dead went back to the beginning of human spaceflight. "We need to tell the galaxy," Jake said. They need to know what humanity has done for them. Hayes shook her head. They won't believe it. Or if they do believe it, they'll want to help. And we can't let them help. This is our burden. Why? Amy asked. Why does it have to be just humans? Hayes walked to a viewport and looked out at the stars. Because we're the only ones who can do it. Other species advance and then forget. They build great civilizations and then become dependent on their technology. When the signal comes, they're helpless. She turned back to face them. But humans are different. We remember. We pass down the warnings. We prepare for the next attack even when we don't know when it will come. We're willing to appear primitive to stay ready. The tour continued through the ship's weapon systems. The kinetic cannons that had been mocked as obsolete were actually precision instruments, designed to punch through any defense. The metal bullets that seemed primitive were made from alloys that could penetrate energy shields and ignore defensive systems. Every system on this ship has been tested in battle, Hayes explained. We've been fighting the signal servants. For 200 years, we know what works and what doesn't. Ben Carter, who had joined them, studied the ship's engineering with new respect. The redundancy is incredible. Every system has 3 backups. Every component is designed to keep working, even if everything else fails. We learned that lesson the hard way, Hayes replied. The signal doesn't just corrupt technology. It learns from it. Every time we use an advanced system, it adapts. So we use simple systems that it can't understand or control. The group moved to the ship's command center, where Admiral Hayes showed them the real purpose of the human fleet. Maps covered the walls, showing patrol routes that extended far beyond the galactic rim. Red marks indicated where signal installations had been found and destroyed. Yellow marks showed areas that were still being searched. We've been mapping the enemy's territory for centuries, Hayes explained. They're not from our galaxy. They come from somewhere else, somewhere dark and cold. They send these signals ahead of their main forces, trying to weaken civilizations before they arrive. Jake stared at the maps in horror. There were hundreds of red marks, each representing a battle that had raged in the darkness while the galaxy remained oblivious. How many installations are there? We don't know, Hayes admitted. We destroy them as fast as we can find them, but they keep building more. It's like fighting an infection. You have to constantly clean the wound or it spreads. Karen Wells studied the ancient symbols that covered the maps. These routes, they follow patterns that go back thousands of years. You've been patrolling the same areas for millennia. Hayes nodded. The signal always comes from the same directions. Our ancestors mapped these routes with primitive telescopes and basic math. We've been following their guidance ever since. The revelation that struck Jake the hardest came when Hayes showed them the ship's most important room. It was small and simple, containing only a single chair facing a primitive radio. An elderly man sat in the chair, listening to static through old-fashioned headphones. This is our early warning system, Hayes said quietly. We keep someone listening at all times. When the signal returns, and it will return, we'll know immediately. The old man looked up and smiled. His name tag read, Chief Radio Operator Frank Martinez. He had been listening to the dark spaces between stars for 30 years, waiting for the enemy to speak again. It's quiet now, Frank said, but I can feel something stirring out there. The war isn't over. Hayes led them back to the bridge, where she showed them the most important thing of all. It was a simple metal plaque attached to the captain's chair. The words were carved in the ancient human script, but Karain had translated enough to read them. Never give up, never surrender, Jake read aloud. Guard the darkness so others can see the light. That's our motto, Hayes said. It's been the same for every human fleet that has gone into the dark. We sacrifice our advancement so that others can advance. We choose to be primitive so that others can be sophisticated. The weight of humanity's secret burden settled on Jake like a heavy cloak. An entire species had chosen to remain backwards so that the galaxy could move forward. They had accepted eternal mockery so that others could live in ignorance of the true threats that lurked beyond the stars. What happens now? Amy asked. Hayes looked out at the galaxy that humanity protected. Now we rebuild. We train the other species to build simple, effective ships. We teach them to prepare for the next attack. And then we go back to the darkness and resume our watch. She turned to face them all. The galaxy will go back to building advanced technology eventually. They'll forget the lessons of the dark signal crisis. They'll start to think of us as primitive again. And that's fine. As long as they're safe, it doesn't matter what they think of us. Jake realized that he was witnessing the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The human fleet would disappear again, returning to the dark spack.